All right, good morning, students. Welcome to class. This is LIT 202, Introduction to English Poetry. My name is Dr. Ayo Item, and I am co-teaching the course with Dr. Micah Soko. The course outline has been given up. It's on the platform. Everybody should be on the platform. If you're not on the platform, you're wrong. So that you can have information about our classes and get access to lecture materials that will be shared. So as far as this course is concerned, we are going to introduce you to English poetry. And when we talk about English poetry, we are referring to the poetry of the English people. The English people live in England, and when you look at them broadly today, we know them as those who inhabit the United Kingdom currently. The United Kingdom is made up of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. In 2023, I was privileged to visit the United Kingdom on a conference. The conference actually took place at Newcastle, Northern Ireland. But my flight landed in London, and I took a train to Newcastle. I deliberately did that so that I could see the countryside, because I've heard so much about the English countryside going by the poetry that we've been reading. And I was not disappointed, because the English countryside is very beautiful. And the videos are still there online, made me remember the romantic poems that we were taught in undergraduate days and which we still read about today. So when I was there, of course, I was there for about a month or two. After the conference, I had a research fellowship. I was able to experience some of the life there. I wrote a poem too on my experiences in the UK. And I suppose in the course of our interaction, I may be able to get the poem for us to read. The UK is also a place of interesting history. Even when I was there, I was able to visit some sites. For instance, when I went to York, I was shown part of the Edwin Wall built by the Romans. We know that the Romans conquered England at a time. And when you understand English history very well, you realize that whatever the Romans did to the English, they did it to other nations of the world when it was their time to colonize them. Because you need to understand that the the English people were colonized by the Romans. When the Romans colonized England, they imposed their language on them, and that language was Latin. At that time, English was like a vernacular, which people did not even enjoy to speak because they thought it was a language of common local people. So the language of education, language of communication, the language of government, language of governmental administration was Latin. Just as today, when the English came and colonized us, we now look down on our indigenous languages and value the English and speak it better than our indigenous languages. It happened to the English people at a time when the Romans colonized them. They looked down on their own language and preferred the language of the colonizer. So interesting things happen in history, and we learn. And when we learn, we now are in a better position to advise our people. So it was some writers who stood up, some English writers who stood up and said, we must start writing in our indigenous tongue, our indigenous languages. And they started writing, and today the English language is appreciated all over the world, and we even appreciate it better than the honors of the language because we use it every day. And of course, if we can also decide to take the same measure with our language, it will be the same thing. Because even as we speak, there's some white people who are even paying to learn our languages. You've been on the social media, you see some white people speaking Igbo fluently and all of that. So it's about kind of mental reawakening for us to pay attention to our language, appreciate our language, and ensure that we don't get caught up with other people's language while we neglect our own. So that is the idea, and I hope that you get the right information so that if it falls on you to take the right action, you know what to do. So English poetry is the poetry of the English people. Or let me just say, English poetry is the poetry of the English peoples. Actually, when I taught this course last session, I was able to develop the notes for all the topics I taught, and this note will be shared on the platform, but for this time, we are going to engage more with the text, with individual text that we'll be dealing with throughout the duration of the course. So what happened? Because the notes are already there, the most important thing now will be to engage with the individual text, individual poems that we study. Very important. Okay? So most of my course materials are on my personal website, which is ayoitem.com. When you visit ayoitem.com, it's now like a library of literature. You find many things that you read and educate yourself, whether it's related to what we are doing here or not. But if you Google Introduction to English Poetry, I think the first set of notes that will come up will be the one that I wrote on the course. Mostly I write my notes not just for you, because you guys might just be 400 or 500 at most. But if you get to that note now, it has close to 2,000 views, meaning that people in other places have also benefited from that, from it. The English people have an enduring poetry tradition that dates back to the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, or the medieval period, is actually when English literature began. English literature and history began. So given what I've already said, you might wonder why we need to study English poetry. Why do we study English poetry? If actually what we need to do is to promote our language and our literature. The answer lies in historical and educational factors. You see, the common problem that Christians meet is that they focus on their religion and the dogma of that religion more than they focus on other religions and their dogmas. In fact, in certain Christian groups, the pastor will even warn the members not to go to another church in the same Christianity, all right? So that they will not be polluted by the bad doctrines of the other church, but in the same Christianity, not even to talk about another religion, listening to what another religion has to say, okay? And so, sometimes when you get to a point of debate, where you have to defend your religion against another religion, say Islam or Judaism, Christians do fall short, because all they know is what the pastors told them. So the same thing applies to the study of English poetry as Africans. And that's what I intend to explain now. Going by history, Africans were colonized by the British. Most parts of Africa were colonized by the British, including Nigeria. And so when the British colonized us, they imposed their language on us. Remember, I've also told you how the Romans colonized the English people and imposed Latin on them. And so when the English people colonized us, they imposed English on us. Okay? They brought the education system and forced us to go through the education system. They also taught us how to read and write in their language. The British also imposed their culture on us. There was a time when to sound and look British was considered highly preferable, or high test, was considered high test of culture. So the British colonized Africa and other parts of the world from the 16th century and imposed their language and culture on the peoples of these places. They colonized Africa, colonized India, they colonized America. You know that the English people colonized America, and that most white Americans today are British. That's why if you go to America, you have some place names in America that are the same like the ones in England. They simply add something before the name, which is New England, and all of that. So I said the British colonized Africa and other parts of the world from the 16th century and imposed their language and culture on the peoples of these places. For instance, in Nigeria, decades after independence, we still rely on English for most of our official communication. So part of learning the language, or part of learning language or any language at all, involves studying and understanding the literature of that language. To study a language requires that you understand the literature of the language, because the language is enriched by its literature. It is by studying the literature of a particular language that you understand the nuances and the idioms of that language. And which is why we always encourage students to read the literature of the language that they're interested in. If you want to improve your command of the English language, since you're studying English, I encourage you to study classical works of literature in English. That is one veritable way and source of mastering the language. That's why we cannot say, oh, because you're studying English, we should just concentrate on the language part of it. No. Part of understanding English very well is to study the literature, because then it will expose you to the nuances of the language, the idioms of the language, and all the ways that the language could be deployed, including how the language has changed from period to period. So that is why it's important for us to study English poetry. As you proceed, you will also study English drama. You will also study the English novel, all adding to your understanding of English literature. Because when you understand the literature, your language prowess is improved by that understanding. Thus, as students of English, we stand a better chance of learning English by studying English literature, since every language is enriched by its literature. Apart from this, as students of literature in the Department of English, it's imperative for us to have deep knowledge of English poetry, apart from studying literature from other parts of the world, written in English. So we have English literature and we have literature written in English. So you can write it down so that you know the difference. We have English literature and we have literature written in English. Okay? So what is the difference? English literature is the literature of the English people, while literature written in English can be from other parts of the world, except that the language is what? English. Okay, so that's the difference between English literature and literature in English. So for instance, when you were in secondary school, people studied literature in English. That means you did not just study English literature. You studied African literature, you studied literature from other parts of the world, but written in English. So that's the difference between English literature and literature written in English. So we have established now that to write literature in English does not mean that the literature belongs to England or the people of England. No, it's only when English people write literature that's when they can claim it. But when we write our literature in English, it is African literature, but written in English language. So to study English poetry implies studying the language. To study English poetry implies studying the language of the poetry, because you cannot study literature without studying the language. Language is the vehicle through which we understand the literature of a particular people. And literature is used to promote the language of a particular people. For instance, we want to promote Ibibio now. We'll encourage people to write literature in Ibibio language. To study English literature implies studying the language, because the literature is written in the language, which is why people coming to study literature should have some background in the language of that literature. If you are coming to study English literature, you need to have some background in English literature or in English language itself, because if you don't understand the language, you won't be able to even read the literature to understand what it says. So, which is why I'm one of the scholars advocating composite study of literature and language. The composite study of literature means that we study the language and the aspects of literature at once. Whenever we come to the study of literature, we look at the linguistic aspects of that literature as well as the literary aspects combined in one. And not trying to see separate. So, okay, because we are studying literature, so anything language about the literature should be forgotten. And I believe that criticism of literature will be more enriched when we combine language and literature in the study of the text. And so, I encourage you from now on to pay attention to language as you're taught, and when you want to interrogate literature, you want you to pay attention to how that knowledge of the language that you study applies to the literary text. Now, if you use linguistic tools to harvest meaning from literature, your criticism, your interpretation will be richer than if you simply pay attention to the literary aspects of the text. And that is the way to go now. So to study English poetry implies studying the language, the content, and form of the selected poems. And that's exactly what we'll be doing going forward. So what is content and form? Because I've said that to study English poetry implies studying the language, content, and form of the selected poems. Content refers to the subject matter, the themes, and the issues raised in the work. What the work is all about, the themes and the issues raised in the work. Form refers to how the issues are presented, are rendered. The style, the type of language deployed to enhance the content. Let me take that again. Content refers to the subject matter, the themes, and the issues raised in a work of art. That is what the work of art is all about, what it says as content. Form is how the issue is rendered, how the issues are rendered in the text. The way the themes and the subject matter are presented. Form stands for style and techniques. Form stands for the use of language. Form stands for the use of language in the text. And so, in our study of English poetry, when we pick up each poem, we want to look at the issues, we want to look at the language, we want to look at the content, we want to look at the form of the text. Studying English poetry also requires our understanding of English history, right? You cannot study the literature of a people without understanding the history of that people. In fact, when you understand the historical context of the text, you understand the text better. Right? When you understand the historical context of the text, you understand the text better. So studying English poetry also requires understanding of English history, okay, and culture. The reason the English people imposed their literature and education on us was because they wanted us to abandon our culture and embrace their culture, which they succeeded for the most part. Because now people rather want to sound English and behave English than African. Okay? It is important for us to be well acquainted with the literary traditions of each era in relation to the selected poems. When we pick up a poem, we talk about the era in which that poem is located. Poems are linked to the time they were written. Right? Because, for instance, we've said that English poetry began in the medieval period. After that, you have what? The Renaissance period. Right? Then you have the Restoration period. Then you have the Neoclassical period. Then you have the Romantic period. And then you have the Victorian period. And then you have the modern period. So when we pick up a poem, you need to, even if you are not told, ask, in which period is this poem located? Very important, because it helps to understand what that poem is all about. Okay, each period has its own characteristics. The poetry of every period has its own characteristics. You should be able to explain the characteristics of the age, what we call the zeitgeist of the age. Zeitgeist means spirit of the age. Zeitgeist means spirit of the times. Refers to the characteristic quality of the time that distinguishes it from other time periods in history. And when we know the zeitgeist of a particular period, we will see it reflected in the poetry of that time. Very important. So that's how we are going to proceed. Right? That's how we are going to roll. Right? That's how we roll on the course. And that's how we're rolling until the end of the course. It is important for us to be well acquainted with the literary traditions of each era in relation to the selected poems. And as far as this course is concerned, our study of English poetry will take up from the medieval period, because that is where English history began. All right? English history begins from the medieval period and terminates in the modern period. The modern period is the 20th century. So after the modern period, we have the postmodern period, and we still have the postmodern period, but the scope of this course begins from the medieval period and terminates at where? Modern period. And that means we start studying this course from 1066, for instance, 1066 and end at 1920. Okay? So that means we will study the medieval poetry, we study Renaissance poetry, we will study Restoration poetry, we will study metaphysical poetry, we will study neoclassical poetry, we will study Romantic poetry, we will study Victorian poetry, we will study modernist poetry. And that's what we'll be covering For each period, we will study the dominant poetic forms and tradition. For instance, when we say medieval poetry, we'll ask the question, which types of poetry were popular in medieval poetry? So that's the dominant forms and dominant poetry tradition. We'll study the zeitgeist of the period. What do we mean by zeitgeist? Spirit of the age. Very intelligent class. We'll study the prominent poets, and we'll study the extant poems, important poems of the period. We'll note their literary value. We'll study their content and form. All right? What does it mean to study the content and form of a poem? Content is what the work of art says. Form is how it says it. Content is the issue. Form is the technique and style of presenting the issue. So we have an intelligent class here, and we can proceed. What is poetry? Poetry can be defined as a genre of literature written in lines and stanzas. But poetry is not only written. Poetry is not only written. We also have poetry that is not written, which is oral poetry. Written poetry is called modern poetry. In fact, whenever you hear the term modern attached to any type of literature, know that it means written literature. Modern drama means written drama. Modern poetry means written poetry. Modern novel means written novel. And the idea of modern is predicated on the issue of colonialism, because the written tradition came with the colonial masters. The written tradition came with the colonial masters. Until then, what we had in Africa was mostly oral tradition. And so our literature existed in the oral mode. But because the Europeans valued the written tradition, when they came, they thought that we didn't have anything. We didn't have literature, but then we didn't have literature because it was not written down. We didn't have culture because it was not written down. We didn't have history because it was not written down. We didn't have knowledge because our knowledge was not written down. Whereas what we had was called oral tradition, a body of knowledge that is transferred from generation to generation through the oral mode. But the colonizer values whatever is written. And so when they looked and they didn't see anything written, they said, oh, these people don't know anything. They don't have religion, they don't have culture, they don't have education, they don't know anything. And so they brought the written tradition. And that's why when we use the term modern today to describe any form of literature, we're simply saying, this is the one the colonial masters brought. But we have to claim our own literature which existed in the oral mode. Our stories, our songs, our dances, our chants, and so on and so forth. So there is oral poetry without prejudice to written literature. So, however, it should be noted that the British colonizers brought to Africa the written tradition of literature, while Africa had the oral tradition. So the advent of colonialism made us believe that if literature is not written, then it is not literature at all. It is colonialism that makes us to think that literature has to be written, because the word literature comes from Latin, litera. So the white man wanted us to believe that if you must have literature, then it has to be written down. Because for them, the term literature comes from the Latin root litera, meaning what? Writing. So for them, whatever is literature is written. But we are here to debunk that claim that literature is not that which is only written, that we have oral literature. Okay? And the truth is even that before you have written literature, you need to first of all have oral literature, because no society began with writing. All societies evolved writing over time. What actually preceded written literature is actually oral literature, even in the English tradition. So literature began in the oral mode, including poetry. For instance, the epics were usually sung. It was after several years, after several centuries, that when writing was invented, that these epics were written down. But then not all of them were written down, because most of them were lost. Because the problem with the oral mode is that if those who custody the material die or without transferring, then the material dies with them. But the good thing was that it was not one person that was the custodian of the materials. It was owned by the community collectively. And so, if this one does not remember, this one will remember. But if a war happens and a people is wiped out, then the literature might just be gone. Because you see, people of that time were moving libraries. Yes, our elders. In fact, even if you go to the village today, those old people that you call witches and wizards, that you don't want to go close to, so that you will not die, so that you graduate on time, are actually living libraries. People say living libraries. Living libraries. Yeah. Because when you go and sit down with them, they will tell you stories of the past. And most of them, the unfortunate thing is that nobody goes to talk to them anymore. Everybody's just waiting for them to die so that they'll bury them, so that the witches and the wizards will disappear. Understand? Okay? But if you go to them, have a recorder, go to them and sit down, ask them questions about what happened in the past. You see that you can learn a whole lot from them. Because they are what? They are living libraries. They have knowledge. You can ask them about the Civil War. You can ask them about what happened in the community that you won't even know. Okay? And from there you have what we call primary source of knowledge. Knowledge from someone who actually witnessed it or knew it or experienced it. So I hope that I hope I've been able to convince and not to confuse you that our old people in the villages are living libraries that you need to visit and ask questions so that you can know about what happened in the past. We know for sure that the epics were usually composed and recited from memory. Which is why we are not using our brains again, right? People can't even quote a few lines of poetry. Students today can't even quote a few lines of poetry. In our time, we quoted literature every day. Even when we were walking on the road, we were quoting literature. All right? But how many poems can you quote? That's why we are saying that the epic was composed and recited from memory. And this was done until when writing was invented, before they were written down. We study English poetry because we understand that colonialism exerted tremendous influence on the colonized, including the culture of the colonized, the literature of the colonized. In fact, no aspect of our life was spared by colonialism. You look at our court system today, it is taken from colonial era. That's why they look so inhumane, so harsh. And we are actually living in an era when we are trying to decolonize our society. But how are you going to decolonize How are you going to decolonize when you don't even know how you were colonized? That's why you need to study the literature. If you want to decolonize African literature, then you need to study English literature to know how English literature affected our literature. Because the English people taught Africans how to write. And that means that Africans could have been affected by that teaching. Okay? And so, if we want to rebel, then we need to know, you need to study your enemy in order to defeat your enemy. And that's why I started by saying that Christians don't even study other religions. And that's why they are usually beaten in arguments. To say you're a Christian but you've not read the Quran. How are you able to argue with the Muslim who has read the Bible? Because when you read the Quran, you know the weaknesses there, and you're able to defend your religion better. But the Muslim has read the Bible, you've not read the Quran. Who is more limited in knowledge? It's you. So you can never defeat an enemy that you don't know anything about. That's what you need to understand. When we study English poetry, we will have a better understanding of our literary history, where our literature came from. So you get. And then we will know the commonalities and differences between our literature and the literature of the English people. We will understand the different modes, the different style, and different languages. As a genre of literature, poetry is unique for its economy of words. As a genre of literature, poetry is unique for its economy of words, owing to space limitation. They need to be precise, they need to be concise in our choice of words. Poetry is noted for opaque diction. We've said this before in our introductory poetry classes. And obscure imagery. Poetry makes use of symbolism and other figurative languages. Those are the major characteristics of poetry, which we learned in Introduction to Poetry. Poetry is noted for its economy of words. Poets don't waste words, they use words only when necessary because they have to communicate so much in such a little space. Poetry makes use of opaque diction. That's words that are pregnant with meaning, words that when you look at them, you can interpret them in 3 different ways, and they still apply to the meaning of the poem. Makes use of obscure imagery. Poetry makes use of symbolism. Poetry communicates with symbolism, the use of symbols. Poetry makes use of figurative expression. Poetry makes use of idiom, and so on and so forth. These are the characteristics of poetry. To study English poetry equally involves understanding the major poetry traditions, understanding the types of poetry, and so on and so forth. The medieval period in English poetry and literature began from 476 AD, that is the 5th century, and ended around 1492, that is the 15th century. You know, when the English people came, they destroyed our civilization here in Africa, and we wrote the history and said that they made us as barbaric people and primitive people, naked and moving around like apes. When the truth was that about this time in history, we had flourishing kingdoms in Africa, pre-colonial kingdoms that surpassed Europe. Okay? The first universities in the world were in Africa. But when they came, they destroyed everything, and then we wrote the history and made it look like we didn't know anything. And that is the problem with the written tradition, because the person who writes something down tends to be the one telling the truth. Okay, and you people have believed that the Europeans brought civilizations to you because they told you so. having destroyed your own, now to be civilized, which is a lie, right? So when they tell you that, remember that when the Europeans first came to this part of the world, for instance, to the kingdom of Benin, they made an empire, and when they came, they had to even bow down to our kings. Yeah. All right. And I'm remembering that because of this time period, because this was the time period that our pre-colonial kingdoms were flourishing here in Africa. So the Europeans did not civilize us at all. They destroyed our civilization and turned around to say that they brought civilization to us. The period is also referred to as the Dark Ages. So while they were living in caves, you had already flourished, they had already gone ahead of them. When they didn't even know anything about hygiene and sanitation, we had known all those things. So they didn't civilize us at all. This period is also known as the what? The Dark Ages. The Dark Ages. The reason we call it the Dark Ages is because it was retrogressive in nature, following the breakup of the Roman Empire. So it was like going back in time, because the Roman Empire gave us the classical period where knowledge flourished. But with the breakup of the Roman Empire, it was going back in time because the English people in this period were backward in science and in development, because they lost the light of enlightenment that came with the existence of the classical Roman Empire. The major characteristic of the medieval period is that it was dominated by religion and religious views. The lives of the people of this period were governed by the dogma of religion, from the cradle to the grave. So imagine someone being raised with religion and their worldview is conditioned by that religion. You could imagine how their life would be. The church imposed its ideologies on the people. By that time, we only had one church. That's why we say the church. When we look back to the medieval period today, we say that it was backward, with delayed development in science, technology, and the evolution of secularism. Medieval society was not secular because it was governed by religion. Your life was all about praising God, worshiping God, paying tithes, praying for your sins to be forgiven, and all of observing religious rites from when you were born until you die. So medieval poetry comprises religious verses, mostly religious verses. So the literature of this period was dominated by religion. If religious worldview dominated the period, then the literature of the period was dominated by what? Religious views. Medieval poetry comprises religious verses, poems that are meant to make you closer to God, make you have a better relationship with God, make you repent of your sins and live a good life on the earth, obey the church authorities. These were religious verses. Medieval poetry comprises court poetry, romance, and epic narratives. Romance and epic narratives. Important medieval writers and poets were Geoffrey Chaucer and Dante Alighieri. So Dante Alighieri represents the Italian literature tradition, whereas Geoffrey Chaucer was English. Right, so he represents the English literary tradition in the medieval period. Please note that. But the two individuals had the same idea, and that idea was that they favored writing in indigenous languages. They advocated writing literature using indigenous languages at a time when English was considered vernacular. and Latin, the language of the colonizer. Well, this time the English people were colonized by the Romans. So at the time when English was considered vernacular, looked down upon, Chaucer and Dante believed that literature should be written in their indigenous languages. This is what they call the common tongue. A language should be written, literature should be written with the common tongue, or the local language. I said at this point, the English people were colonized by the Romans, and so the official languages were Latin and Greek. So it's like now if someone stands up and says, we should not write with English again, let us use the Bible to write our literature. That's exactly what Geoffrey Chaucer and Dante Alighieri did in that time. They favored writing literature with indigenous languages. And the indigenous language at that time was English. And today, English is the language that we use in Africa, and we even abandon our indigenous languages in Africa to use English. And we are here to learn from history. So it should be noted that the English language was a vernacular in the medieval period. In medieval England, the English language was vernacular, while Latin and Greek were the language of worship and governmental administration. Just as the British colonized Africa and imposed their English on them, the Romans colonized the British and imposed their languages on them. An important development in medieval literature and scholarship was the extension of the allegorical interpretation of the scriptures to literature. Until the medieval period, only the Bible was interpreted using allegory. So it was in the medieval period that allegorical interpretation was extended to literature. That is the contribution of medieval scholarship to the development of literature, interpreting literature using allegory. And what is allegory? An allegory can be defined as a work of art which has more than one level of signification. An allegory is a work of art which has more than one level of meaning. An allegorical work has the surface meaning and the deep meaning. The surface meaning is the meaning that everyone understands. The deep meaning requires a deeper knowledge in order to understand. A good example of an allegorical work of literature is George Orwell's Animal Farm. So in Animal Farm by George Orwell, the surface meaning is the depiction of animals in a farm complaining about oppression by the human owner and plotting to take over the farm from the owner and effect their freedom from human ownership. Eventually they are freed after a rebellion, but then they cannot govern themselves because their leadership is oppressive. The animals' leadership are oppressive, and there is division among the animals along the lines of those who are superior and those who are less superior. The superior animals now are the pigs, and they take the best things, best produce of the farms, especially the milk, and they keep changing the laws to favor themselves while the other animals just work without rewards. And in the end, because they cannot manage themselves, they have to bring back human beings. The human being tricks them, and it's very likely that at the end of the novel, we don't know the difference between animals and human beings again. So even children can read the novel at that level and understand. That is the surface meaning of Animal Farm. But the deep meaning is that it talks about human society and the fact that in every ideology, in any ideology, human nature defeats the ideals of that ideology. Because human nature is imperfect. All ideologies, no matter how lofty the ideals are, will be defeated when human beings are made to practice the ideology. Whether it is in communism or capitalism. Because when the novel begins, all major is operating in a capitalist system. But the animals dream of a socialist society where all animals will be free and the wealth of the society will be owned by everybody. Because that's what they will tell you in communism and socialist societies. That the wealth of society will be collectively owned by everybody. Everybody will have the same rights, it's equal rights, to the resources of the society. Until when the practice of the system begins and you realize that all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Okay? So what we learn in Animal Farm is that human nature persists no matter how lofty the ideology being practiced. And that's the deep meaning of the text. Because the animals want their freedom, but after winning the freedom, they now created the classes among themselves, whereby at some point they will make a law that says that that only certain animals are important than other animals. For instance, the pig said that they will need milk, that the only ones to take milk, right? Because they are the ones who do the brain work, right? Other animals who don't do the brain work don't need milk because milk is good for the brain. And since we do the brain work, they don't go to the farm to struggle like the animals. But once the milk is ready, they take it because they are doing the brain work. All right, it's like when your senators and your presidents and governors and bigger salaries because they say it's not easy to make laws. To make laws you need a lot of money. Whereas the ordinary civil servant who works for 35 years cannot point to a plot of land or point to a good house. But a local government chairman, in just 4 years, is made for life. Can point to bank accounts abroad, point to lands, point to houses. But someone who works for 35 years cannot have any of those things. And that is the kind of an unequal society that is practiced in Animal Farm, which is not really about animals, it's actually about human beings, the injustice that persists in our society. So one important thing you need to note about medieval literature is that it was in medieval literature that allegorical study of literature was inaugurated. It was in the medieval period that the allegorical study of literature was inaugurated. And most works written, most literary works written in the medieval period were allegories. Right. So most works studied in medieval literature are allegorical in nature, and their deep meaning usually has religious connotation and spiritual allusion. Another important aspect of medieval literature is anonymous authorship. Everybody say anonymous authorship. Anonymous authorship. What do we mean by anonymous authorship? It means that we do not know the authors who wrote most of the works published in medieval literature. So, when you're studying medieval literature, prepare to come across works of anonymous authorship, where you do not know who the authors are. So in medieval times, authors did not think of themselves as the original owners of their works, but rather they saw themselves as retellers of existing stories. Retellers of existing stories. They didn't see themselves as those who started the story. They simply saw themselves as people who retell the stories. They saw themselves as retellers and embellishers of already existing stories. That's why they did not append their names to the work. So when we meet again, we'll pick one or two texts from medieval literature and study. For now, good morning.